enter here.
This is a story about a time when I went on a courage test with some friends. I went to a shitty university in Tohoku a few years ago and lived alone about 15 minutes away by car. One evening while hanging out with 4 college buddies, one of them suggested we go on a test of courage. We were all up for it. We started off at this well-known spot, famous for people taking their own lives there, a bridge. But nothing happened, so it was just boring and not at all scary. So we looked up another place on our phone. We found out about this old tunnel near my apartment, up in the mountains, with rumors of a woman's ghost who died in a fire and the cries of a baby that could be heard sometimes. When we got there and started walking towards that tunnel, just getting near the entrance felt super creepy. The darkness inside the tunnel was intense. We played rock, paper, scissors to see who'd walk through to the end alone and come back first. The first one came back and said it was really freaky inside, and I was already scared stiff. I was second, and when it was my turn, I could barely see with my phone's light. The tunnel was short, but the thought of something lurking to the side, just out of my vision, scared me. I tried to not think about it. After about 5 minutes, I was out on the other side and onto a forested part by the road, so I headed back. The third friend took over for me. After I got back, he went in, but he didn't come out. 10 minutes passed, then 15. We started joking around about him, but by 30 minutes, we started to panic a bit, thinking he might be hurt or something worse. We all went back to the tunnel, calling his name. We found him halfway through the tunnel, huddled and shaking like anything I'd ever seen. This was the first time I'd seen anyone shaking like that from anything but the cold. The fear on his face sent a chill down our spines, so we quickly helped him out of there. We left and drove to a nearby convenience store. At the convenience store, with the light and normalcy returning color to his face, he finally shared why he was so terrified. He told us when he was close to the tunnel's end, he saw a figure shrouded in shadow. But it wasn't just standing there. It was moving unnaturally fast, darting from one side of the tunnel to the other, like it was coming for him. It stopped just short of the light from his phone and disappeared. But he felt a cold breath on his neck and heard a whisper that chilled him to the core, though he couldn't make out the words. We didn't know what to believe, but the sheer terror in his eyes was enough to convince us not to stick around. I haven't gone back to any haunted spots since that night.
This is a story that a friend of a friend actually experienced. It happened when about 5 of us went to a certain tunnel in the Suwa area of Nagano Prefecture at night to test our metal. It's the same place used for filming the movie I'm Coming to See You. The tunnel has a peaceful atmosphere during the daytime, just like in the movie. But at night, it seems to be dangerous, and the distance is longer than in the movie. The tunnel was longer than it looked like, so we decided to do a test of courage, with the loser of a rock, paper, scissors fight going to the far end of the tunnel and then coming back. Finally, one was to enter the tunnel, and the one who lost entered the tunnel as a joke. However, he didn't come back, so we decided to just get back in the car and wait. We were looking at the entrance of the tunnel, and after a while, he finally returned. When we saw his face, we felt an unusual atmosphere, and we started to tremble. The boy's face was pale and bloodless, and then he said, "You said you were going to wait for me. You told me you were waiting for me." The four of us had been waiting for him, so what he was saying was obviously not true. But then, we found something even scarier. When we looked at the boy's feet, we saw that a woman's hand had a firm grip on his ankle. All four of us saw that, so we were not mistaken. We were so terrified and confused that we left the boy behind and just drove away. The boy has not returned since and is still missing. I'm too scared to go to this place, and I have not gone back to look for him.
I think it's around Isehara in Kanagawa Prefecture. Have you ever heard of the Nanasawa Tunnel? I think the real name may be Yamakami Tunnel. About 2 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, I was living in Atsugi City, Kanagawa. There were many haunted places, like abandoned hospitals and so on. There was not much to do, so I used to go there with my friends and have a good test of courage. I used to go to places where there were rumors of hauntings. The rumors I heard about Nanasawa Tunnel were, if you go there on a rainy night, you might see a woman in a white one-piece dress. I think it was something like that anyway. My memory is a little hazy. I like scary places, but I have never actually seen a ghost or anything like that. That was, until then. That day, my friend A, who had brought up the idea of going to Nanasawa Tunnel, B, C and I, who always hang out together, decided to go. I drove the car. We bought flashlights at a convenience store on the way. We followed the directions that A had given us. We went up the mountain road more and more. I think it was around 2 a.m. The lights around us were getting dimmer, and the road was getting narrower. The road became unpaved and rough, and there were no other cars to be seen. To be honest, I was quite a novice and wanted to turn back. In the end, I couldn't say anything about it, so I just kept going. Suddenly, B said, "Huh?" I looked in the direction B was pointing and saw what was probably an abandoned car on the side of the road, hidden by the grass. "It's just an abandoned car, isn't it?" A said. "No, there were people in it. Didn't you see it?" B was totally freaked out, but I didn't see anything either. It was dark, and it looked like it was just the atmosphere. C also didn't seem to have seen anything, so the three of us calmed B down. I was quite frightened inside though. Anyway, I went ahead and we came across something like a gate. The no trespassing bar was raised, so I continued on my way. I followed the narrow road and rounded a curve, and suddenly the road opened up. There was a parking lot on the left. I saw the tunnel in front of it. The tunnel was smaller than I expected, and I think it was about the width of a car. It was pitch black in the tunnel. I decided to pull over at the clearing, but when I turned off the engine, my heart almost stopped. The gas tank, which was nearly full before we came here, was about to run out. I told the other three guys that they must have seen it wrong. Well, I was scared too, so I decided to assume that I must have misseen it. We got out of the car and approached the tunnel. It was raining lightly. Gradually, the atmosphere around us began to look suspicious. B seemed to want to turn back, and so did I. A, who was very strong, quickly went inside with a flashlight in his hand. C entered after A, and B and I followed in line. The inside of the tunnel was more gloomy than I had expected. I am not psychic at all, but I could feel that this was bad. A seemed to be enjoying himself, looking at the graffiti on the walls and laughing as he talked. I think it was when we reached the middle of the tunnel that suddenly the flashlight started blinking, and before I could think, it went out. "Whoa!" B exclaimed, and I dashed towards the entrance as fast as I could go. Strangely enough, even in the dark, that entrance was faintly bright. All four of us managed to get back to the car. As expected, A was pale. "Shall we go back now?" C said. A said, "Hey, is there something behind me?" None of the three of us really understood what A was trying to say. "Didn't you guys hear anything?" The three of us looked at each other and shook our heads. "You didn't hear it the whole time we were running back?" "Oi, oi, oi." They were chasing after us. "I didn't hear anything. Did you?" I asked B and C, and both of them agreed. Apparently, only A could hear it. The voice kept coming closer and closer, and just before we got to the car, A said in a half-crying voice that he heard it in his ear. "Oi." We didn't hear it, but just hearing that from A was enough for us. We hurriedly started the car and headed back the way we came. I was completely freaked out. I think we all were. I couldn't look in the rearview mirror. As I drove away, all of a sudden, I saw a blank white bar in front of me. The bar of the construction gate was down. It was up when we arrived. My heart was about to jump out of my mouth. I got out of the car and ran to raise the bar. After I raised it, I ran back to my car door, which was still open. My car is a high four-wheel drive. It has a step under the door that you put your foot on to get up to the seat. There was a white plastic umbrella on the step. I didn't see anything like this when I looked at it earlier. I mean, why an umbrella? I was so scared. I hurried down the mountain as fast as I could. After all that, all four of us went back to A's room to take a rest. C, who was behind A going up to the room, shouted, "Whoa, what's wrong with this?" C pointed to the back of A's shirt that had been sliced open lengthwise. All four of us were silent and could not sleep until dawn. The next morning we parted ways and I went home. It was about that evening when I received a phone call from C. Apparently, A had a fever and his back was swollen. When I got over to his place, A was groaning in bed. He was lying on his back. When I asked him to show me his back, it was swollen to the size of a person's fist. I'd never seen anything like that before, so we decided it would be best to take him to the hospital. C and I supported A and took him to the nearest emergency room. We contacted A's parents, and they said they would be on their way tomorrow. The doctor said he would have to check him for now, so he would have to stay in the hospital today. I wonder if it's due to that thing from yesterday, C mumbled with a blue face. I could only nod in silence. From there, A was transferred to a university hospital and ended up being hospitalized for nearly 2 months. The cause was unknown. He was given antibiotics. The day after B went to the tunnel, he fell on his motorcycle and broke his leg. I also sprained my ankle 3 days later, but this was just carelessness. I don't mean to blame the tunnel for everything. I knew there must be something going on in a place like that where there are so many rumors. As an aside, when I went to visit A 2 weeks after he was hospitalized, he was lying in bed, but he had calmed down completely. The swelling on his back was about the size of a child's face. I half-jokingly wondered if it would turn into a face. But I'm glad to say that I was wrong.
"5 years ago, I was transferred from Saitama to Atami due to a company change. I'd never been to Atami and was kind of looking forward to it. though it wasn't a huge deal or anything. As soon as I got there, I dropped by the new office to greet everyone and chat about the job. The head guy gave me the afternoon off, so I decided to take a walk and get to know the place until it got dark. I heard from a coworker that the view at night was something else, so I went for a drive later on to see it for myself. It was around 11 p.m. Atami is full of hills, and I was driving around them, checking out the lights and figuring that I'd find my way back eventually. I ended up getting pretty lost. I found this short tunnel about 30 meters long, and something about it didn't feel right to me. I'm not into ghost stories, never had anything weird happen to me, but something about this tunnel made me not want to go through it. Still, I didn't want to drive back up the hill, so I drove in. Halfway through, I stopped without thinking. Right there, a bunch of kids were in the tunnel, 5 or 6 of them playing with rocks. They were piling them up and kicking them. I was shocked. It was after midnight, and there were kids in the middle of the tunnel. I was too scared to scream. It was like being hit in the heart with a hammer. My heart just dropped and I was frozen, shaking. But then, one of the kids turned to me and smiled. A tremendous smile, teeth bared almost too wide. And at that moment, I finally screamed. I backed up the car as fast as I could while screaming, and I scraped the door against the wall, sending sparks flying, and made a U-turn back to the entrance. I somehow made it back to my dorm, and I did not sleep a wink. The next day, I told the local at the office about the tunnel and the kids. Her face went pale when I mentioned it. She said that was the entrance to Nishikigaura, which is a spot known for people taking their own lives there, and driving through could have been bad news. I was just relieved that I didn't go all the way through, and happy that there were no cars behind me. I didn't see another soul on the way back up that hill. That was the first time, and definitely the last time that I had a scare like that.
I'm going to write about an actual experience I had about 20 years ago that I still can't believe. This is because there's no one around me who is familiar with paranormal stuff at all, so I don't know how to interpret the actual event. When I was a college student, I was living a life that I didn't really care about. I had no goals or dreams. I didn't belong to any clubs or circles, and I just spent my time aimlessly and lazily. The only thing I did was to go for a drive with my friends K and S, who were just as aimless as I was. But we gradually got tired of that and started talking about exploring abandoned roads, if we were going to go for a drive anyway. We wanted to go as far as we could go by car, so we decided to drive on roads that were no longer in use due to the construction of a bigger road, or on narrow side roads that we did not know where they led, rather than on closed roads. We were bored and unmotivated, but this was a lot of fun, and we never got tired of it. Perhaps it was the unusual space presented by the abandoned road that suited our temperament. One day, Kay said to me, "I found a nice place. It's a new spot to explore abandoned roads." It was after 2 p.m, but S and I, who had no plans, decided to go there now and headed for the site in Kay's car. The location was about 30 minutes by car from the university, a short drive down a mountain road. A narrow road ran diagonally from a thick road that cars often drive on. We entered the narrow road. We found weeds growing out of the ground, pebbles and branches that had fallen down, and it was obvious that no one was using the road. I wondered if there was such a road, and as we continued on, it came to a dead end after about 100 meters. "What? Is this all?" Kay pointed to the side with a smug look on his face. "Look at that." I'd expected to see a concrete retaining wall to prevent landslides all the way along the side of the road, but it ended in the middle of the road, and only a section of wire mesh had been put up. But when I looked closer, I saw that the road continued behind the wire mesh. "We can go in there." Indeed, although the wire mesh was stretched, it itself was only fixed with a wire, and it was easy to get in if it was cut. Then, Kay cut the wire with nippers he had prepared in advance, and we went into the back of the road that was blocked off. To be honest, I didn't feel like I was doing anything wrong at all. I knew that the wire mesh could be reattached with wire when we got back, and there was no way I could drive for such a long time on such a blocked road. Even the road we had just taken was covered with weeds and pebbles. I was sure that even a little further down the road, there would be a fallen tree blocking the way and we would be unable to proceed. Surprisingly, however, the road did not appear as desolate as we expected, and it was even cleaner than the road we had just taken. We drove carefully along the narrow mountain road for about 5 minutes. After a while, a tunnel appeared in front of us. Rather than just a normal tunnel, it was like a brick aqueduct with a hollowed out archway that could be passed under. It was wide enough for the chimney to pass through, and we drove through it. As we drove through, the road began to look a little rough, and the asphalt began to be strewn with stones. Suddenly, S shouted, "Hey, stop, look at that!" S was pointing behind the car, in the direction of the tunnel we had just passed through, when he saw a torii gate straddling the tunnel exit. The torii gate, like the one at a Shinto shrine, was standing close to the tunnel's entrance and exit. It was completely invisible from the other side, and I could only assume that when you go through the tunnel, you automatically pass through the torii gate as well. We felt somewhat queasy and hesitated whether to go back or not, but decided to go as far as we could go anyway. We went another 500 meters or so. The road that had been paved with asphalt, although it was still rough, was cut off, as if a boundary line had been drawn. From there, an unpaved dirt road continued all the way. It was weird that there were 2 shrines at both ends of the boundary line, between the asphalt and the dirt road. The road in front looked like asphalt, and the road in the back looked like dirt. By this time, I was feeling a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and excitement about what lay ahead, and had no desire to turn back. Fortunately, the width of the road did not change after it became a dirt road, and there were no trees down that made it impassable. However, in retrospect, I probably should have noticed then that there were no wheel ruts at all, and that the road was too clean for a road that had been sealed off. After a while, we came to an open area, as if the previous mountain road had been a lie. Except for the road our car was on, we could see nothing but plains on both sides of the road. It looked like rice paddies, but there was no sign that they were being used. Before we knew it, the sky was so clear and blue, without a cloud in sight, that I was moved by the splendor of the scenery. But then I came back to myself and thought, where the hell am I? Was this an abandoned village or something? It was a strange and surprising feeling to find such a spacious and beautiful land, not far from where we usually live. I wondered how far this stretch of road went. Just as I was about to think that, I saw a small black building ahead of the road. As we got closer, it began to appear larger and larger, and its shape became clearer and clearer. It appeared to be a thatched building, but I soon realized that it was not just a thatched building. It was unusually large. I had never seen a thatched building of this size. It was about the size of a school gymnasium, or perhaps even larger. Why would such a magnificent building be erected at the end of a closed road? when we arrived at the building, we realized that the road we had just come in on was a straight road leading to this building, with no branches along the way. This building was at the end of the road. We thought it was an abandoned village, but there was no village, only this one building, and we could only think that the road we had just come in on was the only road leading to this building. We parked the car and got out. I was surprised at how refreshing it felt. The air was clear, the sky was blue and cloudless, and there was not a sound of birds or wind. The temperature was just right, like early spring, and I almost wished I could stay here forever. But the huge thatched building in front of me cancelled that out. What in the world is this building? I have heard that thatched buildings can be damaged if they are not taken care of, but this one did not look like that. It was an old, generally blackened wooden structure, but it did not look dilapidated at all. I wondered if someone was still using it. "Let's take a look inside," I suggested, and Kay was on board, but S was not so keen and said he would go around the building for now. The door to the building was heavy but unlocked, and I was able to open it. When I looked inside, I noticed a peculiar, musty, old-fashioned smell. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. Relieved that no one was there, Kay and I went inside. It was dimly lit, but we could see what was going on inside by the light coming through the cracks and the light from the open entrance. It was a large, wooden-walled space. What looked like shelves could be seen against the wall, but there was nothing in it. There was a sliding door on the wall to the left of it, and it looked like there was a further room beyond it, and there was nothing else but the floor and walls. The top was too dark to see clearly, but everything seemed to be vaulted all the way to the ceiling. It took some courage, but I decided to open the sliding door and take a look. I had come this far and felt compelled to check it out. I opened the door and was surprised to see that it was surprisingly bright inside. There seemed to be numerous light-emitting windows on the upper part of the room, making it brighter than the space on this side of the entrance. However, I soon realized that the room was not only bright, but also unusual. First of all, it was huge. It was about the size of a gymnasium, and there were 5 unusually thick pillars extending from the ground to the ceiling, evenly distributed throughout the large space. The thickness of these pillars was really unusual. A single wooden pillar with a diameter of about 3 meters and a length of more than 10 meters. Hey, do trees this big even exist in Japan? Kay had a point. I had never seen such thick pillars. As I was looking around, I wondered why they had put up such pillars. And then Kay shouted, "Oh," and I looked at the middle of the 5 pillars. I saw that on the middle pillar, among the 5 pillars, there was something that looked like a handwritten omyofuda, which is like a handwritten talisman or charm, which had been nailed to the pillar with nails. Not ordinary nails with heads, but iron-like nails with pointed ends, and a large number of them had been nailed to the pillar. The writing was done with a brush and looked like symbols, like Chinese characters, but I could not read what they said. Then, Kay said, "There is something attached to it." I looked closely and sure enough, there was something. It looked like a dried up lump of something stuck between the talisman and the nail. We both looked up at about the same time and saw the answer simultaneously. What was hammered into it were human ears. A great number of human ears had been attached to the pillar, along with the talisman. The ones on the bottom were too rotten or dried out to recognize, but for some reason, the ones on the top were newer, and I recognized them as human ears. I think it was close to about 1,000. And to my horror, some of the ears that didn't look that old were on the top part. Oh my god. We dashed out of the room and out of the building through the entrance we had come in through. I don't know what kind of place this is, but I was sure it was bad. I knew we were in trouble. I wanted to drive away immediately, but S was still gone. He said he was going to go around the outside of the building, as I recalled. He might be in the back of the building. Me and Kay ran as fast as we could and went around the backside of the building. It was a big building, so it took us a while just to go around. When we went around to the back of the building, we found S there. He was there, but his behavior was strange. He was standing there in a daze, and the next moment we were standing there too, behind that building. Behind the building, there was just a flat plain, and on the plain, simple wooden platforms were lined up in rows, equally spaced, with 2 or 3 candles glowing brightly on them. And they continued to glow, not exaggerating, until they faded beyond the horizon. What the hell is this place? The sound of my and Kay's voices brought us back to our senses, and S noticed us and came closer. He then pointed out something that Kay and I had not noticed at all. Hey, where does the sun come out here? The sun. The sky was blue and clear, not a cloud in sight, but the sun was nowhere to be seen. The sky was bright, but the brightness of the entire sky was uniformly the same. You know, I thought it was weird from the beginning. Too quiet, right? Have you heard a bird or creature since we got here? More to the point, not even a blade of grass on the road on the way here. S was already half crying. Anyway, we knew we couldn't stay here, so we hurried back to the car trying to calm S. On the way, we caught a glimpse of the entrance to the building, and it looked like the door was closed. I think that Kay and I had left the door open earlier, but I don't remember that part clearly. Anyway, we had to leave. Kay drove us back the way we came, and we managed to return to the entrance of the first abandoned road. When we reached the national highway, the sun was setting in the west. I knew we had made it back. After that, no psychic disturbance or cursed phenomena occurred to me, Kay, or S. However, what we experienced that day is undeniably true, and all 3 of us remember it. When we passed by the entrance to the abandoned road later that day, we found that the narrow road itself, which we had been able to enter before, had been sealed off with a sturdy gate, making it completely impassable. Of course, even if we had been able to get through, we had no intention of ever entering that road again. This is an experience my mum and dad had that happened in December of 2018. They were coming back home from eating out and pulled into their driveway and parked. The area where they live is moderately wooded and on a large plot of land about 20 acres. They got out of their car and started to walk up to the door when they heard a blood-curdling scream coming from only 10 feet away from them. Not only was the scream terrifying, but it was extremely loud. My dad is a state trooper and served in the US Marine Corps, so not much will actually scare him. He's the guy to watch a horror movie at 3 a.m. with all the lights off and curtains open. However, that night, he said he was genuinely terrified. They snapped out of their trance and ran inside, and he came back out with his gun. He got in his patrol car and started checking out the area. He shined his spotlight down into the pasture and around the property, but couldn't find anything. The fact that he did this is alarming because he would never pull a gun out if he was joking, which he has done multiple times. I've only seen him actually pull a gun out 2 other times in my life, and this isn't the only experience. Only about a week after I came back home from college for winter break, I sat on the front porch late one night drinking coffee. It was pretty cold, and reading a book when I heard something eerie coming from the pasture to the east of my house. It sounded like creaking, but there was no wind blowing, and I know the area clearly, and there wasn't a hanging branch or anything for that matter that would justify the sound. Even though it creeped me out, I refused to think anything of it and brushed it off as strange but explainable. Thoroughly chilled, I stopped reading my book because of bad lighting and went inside. After a while, I found that I forgot my book outside and went out again to grab it. This time, I heard a low, poor howl. The only canine creatures that live around their place are coyotes, and when you hear them, it's a mixture of yips and short, pitchy howls. Hearing it and having my fears proved that it was some otherworldly being, I grabbed my book and ran inside. About 20 minutes later, my brother comes home from a friend's house. He walks in and doesn't say anything other than hey. I tell him what I experienced, because we have all experiences that we tell each other to creep each other out. To my surprise, he said he heard the same thing just a couple of minutes earlier when he was walking outside. The sound had moved from its previous location southwest of my position and was now in the northwest corner of the property. He said that the sound was a long, deep but poor or weak, kind of like the one I had heard. My brother seemed more spooked with his encounter than I did with mine. He said that the duration was just so long and then sounded very fake, like a poor imitation. After that, there wasn't any more sightings the entire time I was home. It's since been ruled out as deer, since we have a lot of them, and they make some really strange noises. But after reading through this subreddit, I feel like it may be a Skinwalker issue, or something of the sort. We do live near a spot where the Native Americans hold their powwows, and there is a house in our neighborhood that is built on a Native American burial ground, allegedly. So it wouldn't be a surprise that this may be the case. I have other experiences with some strange sounds and being whistled at in the dark of night, but no sightings so far. I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings-on near here. Strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I have dealt with these myself in the past on hikes and even just relaxing in the park. Here is one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the boonies. The only road to there is a gravel road that is pretty much washed away, so without a good car, you're not getting up there anyways. My cousins lived in a trailer with their mums, right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased. I was the youngest. My grandma was in the hospital with my aunt, so our older cousin, who, all named Denny, had to watch us. Denny was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regards. He would mess around with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we spent playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek, tag, etc. We had been playing pretty far away from the house, and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the only one being hunted. I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property and hid behind a log. I heard my cousins getting closer, so I ran and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, almost a mile from the house. And we saw my cousin, Denny. He looked at us and kind of growled, and we all ran from him, thinking it was a game. We ran back onto the gravel road and we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did it weirdly, kind of gloatingly in a way. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table across the floor, Denny came into the living room from the master bedroom, rubbing his eyes. We had obviously woke him up from all the movement and he was mad. We told him about seeing him chase us, and he got wide-eyed. He told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he came in and told us not to worry, that it was just him scaring us, and we went on with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13, that he told me the truth. It was a skinwalker. He told me that he has dealt with it when he was our age, and told me his story, which I may share as well someday, depending on how far this goes. This, of course, is just one story. There's loads more. Some background. I live in a very religious place in the south, so a lot of people tend to not believe what they hear or see, because it's just the devil playing tricks. That being said, my cousin Denny, who is about 12 years older than me, believes in this too, that what he saw was just a demon and not a skinwalker. Getting this story out of him took a while. He didn't like to talk about it, but I got him to open up about it a bit. This happened around the mid-90s. Denny, much like me and my cousins, spent his childhood around my mama's property with his brother Charlie and his cousin Ken. They would play manhunt and tag and such, like we did. When this story took place, it was in the middle of the summer, and he was around 12. He and Charlie and Ken were playing at a treehouse that is no longer standing. They had just pulled a prank on Ken and were hiding from him in the treehouse. Denny and Charlie stayed in the treehouse until Ken stopped looking. Charlie left and went back into our Mormo's house and left Denny alone. Denny stayed up in the treehouse and read some comics. The treehouse was about half a mile from the house and was on a hill so that you could still see the house from it, but it was still in the woods. At the time, my pawpaw was still alive, but was in Georgia on a retreat, so he was not there, which let the three boys to do whatever they wanted. Pawpaw would holler for them to come in when it started to get dark, because there was, and still is, a large number of coyotes and bears around the house. Denny decided to read comics all day, something he still enjoys, and eventually fell asleep. He woke up and it was dusk. He heard our Mormor yelling for him, and he began to get ready to leave. As he went down the ladder, he heard a coyote yip, and he climbed back up. At this point, he began to get a little upset while telling me the story. He began to explain what the coyote looked like, and I realized it was the same one that me and my cousins had seen growing up as well. It looked like it had mange. It had a large tuft of fur missing on its right side, and you could see the bare, pale skin, and it had human-like eyes. It snarled at him and bore its teeth. He was taken aback by this, and he just sat back down in the treehouse. The coyote sat at the base of the ladder and just looked up at him. He told me that he sat there for about 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to do. He remembered he had a slingshot and decided that the best course of action would be to try and scare it off with that. He said he shot at it, and it just growled more. My cousin was, and still is, a very good shot with a slingshot. I had a couple of bruises to prove it. He reared back and decided to aim at its eyes because he didn't like the way it stared at him. He reared back and got it right in its left eye. It ran away, yowling. At this point in the telling, Denny was getting a little more emotional. He told me that he climbed down the ladder and made a mad dash towards the house. About halfway to the house, there is a large dip in the land, where there are a bunch of bushes and small trees. When he was about there, he told me that he heard coyote yips all around him, and swore that a whole pack had come upon him. He just ran from it, and while he was on his way up the other side of the dip, he tripped and hurt his leg. By now, Denny had started to get upset and had to stop a few times. He told me he got up and started to limp towards the house. This is the part that gave me the chills. He told me he turned and looked behind him and saw not a coyote anymore, but a person. And it looked like it had his face. He said it started to walk toward him in an odd way, but luckily Charlie and Ken started yelling for him, and as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. Denny told Charlie and Ken, but they didn't believe him, and they told him it was just a trick of the night, something that he still tries to believe in. As soon as he told me this, he asked me kindly not to ask him about it anymore, as when he thinks about it, he thinks he sees that coyote outside. Denny is a very religious and reliable man, so when he says weird stuff is happening, I usually believe him. The coyote he saw that night, me and my cousins have seen before as well, along with the stag. Since the night me and my cousins saw it, I've had 2 more encounters, the latest one being last year. To start with, I'm a white female. I was adopted 7 years ago by a Navajo family, and we've always been close, despite obvious cultural differences. Still, I learned about Skinwalkers firsthand, and they've since become an accepted part of my life. I have a ton of Skinwalker stories, but I will start off with just a few. The first happened to my adopted uncle. He lives in Blanding, Utah, a spot not quite notorious for skinwalkers, but full of them nonetheless. He was driving through the canyon area at night and got that familiar feeling. It was dark outside, but the moon illuminated the canyon and the brush enough for him to see out of his peripheral vision that something was running across the desert night. He was in his 40s at the time and a police officer. He started singing in Navajo and kept his eyes on the road in front of him. But he was driving at least 55 to 60 miles per hour, so the shape running through the desert was keeping pace with him, despite his high speed. He said that it looked vaguely human-shaped, but paler than any human he'd ever seen. Still, he didn't look directly at it, and despite his singing, he was getting more and more scared. What my Navajo family always taught me was that these creatures feed on your fear. This one certainly seemed to. My uncle was shaking and sweating when the running thing picked up speed, outpacing his truck. And then, when it was maybe 30 yards ahead of him, it made a sharp right and began to run toward the road. He knew it was going to directly intersect him, and he made up his mind to put his foot on the gas, because being broken down in the middle of the road, in the dark alone, was a death sentence. As it got closer, he sped up, and just as they were about to cross paths, it jumped onto the road. He saw it for the first time then. He described it as a skinny man in jeans and a plaid shirt, with a long face and big yellow eyes, much like cat's eyes. Its arms were thrown up over its head, and its hands kind of flying out behind it. The worst part was that its mouth was open and seemed to be disconnected from its jaw. His chin was just flapping around, about a foot below his nose. It leapt onto the road, and then, just as quickly, jumped out of the way of his truck. He didn't see it again. He prayed the whole way home, and they had a ceremony shortly after that. Another encounter happened to my adopted brother, who is one of the most level-headed and unshakable men I've ever met. He was 30 when this happened. He was at his dad's house, partaking in one of their ceremonies, which happens in a hogan. The rule is that you never leave the hogan alone, because the magic and the energy that you make during these ceremonies is kind of like a supernatural light beacon. And you never know what kind of creatures you're attracting. Still, Eric, my brother, was a pretty rational guy who wasn't afraid of the dark. He'd been in the hogan for hours, chanting and praying, and needed a smoke break and to take a leak. So, against the general rule, he edged out of the roundhouse and out into the night. There was nothing around except for 15 to 20 parked cars, all close to the ceremony area. It was a large gathering, so Eric did his business with no incident and lit up a cigarette. He was standing there, staring off into space, when he got that feeling of being watched. To shake it off, he walked away from the hogan, about 20 feet, and scanned the desert. Everything was quiet, except for the drums coming from the tent and the singing within. Just as he was about to shrug off this weird feeling and chuck his cigarette butt, he saw it. Under one of the vehicles, a dark shape and two shining eyes. The eyes were like animal eyes. They didn't glow on their own, but they had reflective light in them. They glinted right at Eric. They were yellow. The creature didn't really have the shape of any animal he recognized, though he explained to me that it was shaped like Gollum, really skinny, with a round human head. Eric, not scared of something that would make most wet their pants instantly, walked towards the vehicle and bent down to get a closer look. Dust scrabbled around, and he could hear a skittering noise. Bony arms shoved some gravel his way, and the next thing he knew, the creature was gone, and the vehicle was empty. But then he smelled this disgusting, puke-worthy stench, and he got scared then, because in Navajo culture, bad smells are taken very seriously when they're assumed to be supernatural. So he straightened back up, and then he realized the source of the smell. A shadow fell over him, covering him from behind, and he's around 6'2", so this thing, he said he estimated at 7.5 feet at least. He was shivering, and didn't move as it approached him from behind, until it was standing inches away. He could feel it, smell it, see its shadow, and the worst thing, he felt it breathe on his neck. Eric said that it sounded like a horse or a cow when it snorts, and its breath was warm. When he looked at his feet, he saw his own shoes, and behind his right foot, a big hoof. So he closed his eyes and started to sing. Right at that moment, his dad and uncle got a terrible feeling from inside the hogan. They bolted up and exited, calling his name. They found him shivering outside, too terrified to talk, and too terrified to stop singing in Navajo. It took Eric months before he shared this with us, and he did so, expecting us to laugh or call him crazy. But I completely believe his story. This happened to my older brother, who we can call David. It was back in the early 2000s, and he was a senior in high school in a small podunk Utah town. Being a senior and a football player, he kind of fit the stereotype and did stupid things, one of which included walking through the woods late at night, as he put it, to throw rocks and terrorize kids from school. Yes, immature, I know. But he and his accomplice, another Navajo called Sean, who were both seniors on the football team, chose the woods for their antics because cops patrolled the streets and there was a city curfew in place. The route they took went through a skate park, which was rich in Navajo artifacts, and even had a kiva, which you could go down into. So one night, they were sneaking through the forest before the sun had risen, and they had started to stop and shush each other, because they could sometimes hear footsteps in the distance. Unless some other football geniuses had the same idea to walk through the desert, there should have been no one else out there. This continued for a while, until Sean stopped abruptly. David grabbed him and said, "Get down." They dropped to their stomachs, heads down, listening. The footsteps crunching through the dry desert foliage were now accompanied by mumbling. David estimated that the sounds were maybe 100 feet away at first, but then got closer. He couldn't tell if the mutterings were in Navajo, English, or some other language. After the noises remained fairly distant for a while, Sean whispered without looking, "It sounds like a drunk." Several more minutes passed, and David decided to chance a peek as the noises seemed more distant now. It was night, but the moon was bright, casting light off the nearby canyon walls. David was expecting to see a man, but instead, he saw a figure which moved with a tilt to its body, and was long and tall. It was human-formed and walked on 2 feet, but was misshapen and very tall, resembling maybe a Kokopelli or a Navajo patina doll. Not a normal shape in any case. As it mumbled and drifted through the trees, seemingly in search of something, David was captivated, watching it for a few minutes. And then, suddenly, the snapping of twigs and muttering stopped. Everything went quiet, and the figure, whatever it was, had disappeared. After that, David and Sean both felt that whatever had been in the forest was gone. They sat on the ground afterwards, discussing what had just happened. Sean asked about what David had seen, and then stated, "I didn't look because if I would have, it would have known we were both staring." I forgot to ask him if he and Sean went back through the woods. The answer is probably yes. This kind of incident is pretty common within Navajo culture, and it's something they're used to dealing with. Personally, I would have bolted myself. So I live in San Juan County, on the Utah side. I was with some friends and we wanted to party. My friend said her boyfriend had alcohol, so we went to his house. We ended up in this place on the reservation, in the middle of nowhere by a shack, and found him and his dog asleep in a ditch. The first thing I noticed was that there were bones everywhere. Next, the dog got up, but it rose in a really creepy manner. I've never been afraid of any dog ever, but the way this one got up gave me the chills. It was super skinny and looked like it had mange because its fur was patchy and its skin looked leathery. Its eyes appeared human, and it kept balancing on its back legs or crouching over. The whites of its eyes were red while the irises were brown. Next, the guy got up. He was really sketchy. At first, we thought he was just drunk, but he was acting incredibly strange. As soon as he got in the car, it reeked like actual death, as if he smelled rotten and foul. We had to roll the windows down. He was wearing baggy clothing and 4 different jackets. We'll call him Bruce. He was talking incoherently and kept yawning while he spoke, but he seemed to walk mostly normal, except he had a weird limp that made him sway with every step. It turned out he didn't have any drinks, but we had already arrived, so we went to get another friend that we knew. We'll call him Alex. Alex has alcohol, but we had no place for a party, so Bruce said he knows a spot. We let Bruce guide us back to the reservation and to a really sketchy trailer a few miles away from where we initially picked him up. The dog was there, waiting for us. At this point, I just wanted to go home, because the whole scenario was giving me awful vibes, and everything in my body was telling me I needed to leave. I'm not a superstitious person at all, but Bruce's girlfriend was my ride home, so I had no other choice. I decided at that moment that I wasn't going to drink or do drugs with them because of the circumstances. We got out of the car and the creepy dog comes straight to me, knocks me down, and starts trying to dry hump me. But he got the dog off me immediately though, and I ran into the abandoned trailer. Some of the windows were broken and everything was old and dusty. The carpet was torn up and there was no furniture except for some lawn chairs. I took a seat. I overheard Bruce whisper to Alex that he has some spice. My 3 other friends then get into the trailer with me and start taking shots of alcohol. Then Bruce whips out a bowl to smoke something. My friends asked what it was, and he says it's weed. They start smoking, and it doesn't smell like weed at all. I look at it under the flashlight and realize it is indeed spice, and try telling them that it's not weed and that we should probably leave. They make fun of me, take more shots, and more hits. I look out the window and see the creepy dog crawling or running around the trailer. Alex, at this point, is pretty drunk, and he starts yelling at Bruce for killing his dad a few days prior. Bruce gets flustered and leaves with his girlfriend. A few minutes later, the dog tries to open the door with its paws. It doesn't succeed, but I could see it trying since the door had a window. I got really scared because this dog was not normal and was just staring at me through the glass. I start sharing my location with a few people in case something wrong happens. Alex is crying about how Bruce murdered his dad on the reservation and that he can't bring himself to forgive Bruce for what he's done. They're apparently close cousins. I just wanted to go home. Bruce returns with his girlfriend, and a fight breaks out, so we all leave Bruce and his dog at the trailer. Then Bruce's girlfriend randomly has a psychotic episode as we get back to town and decides she wants everyone else in the car to walk home. She screams at them to get out, and they all walk over a mile to get to their homes. She drops me off for some reason, without saying a word. When I get home, I check my phone and find that my friends were scared because something kept throwing rocks at them on their way back. Anyways, I'm convinced that this was an experience with a Yinadlushi or Skinwalker or something. Everyone there was Navajo except for me, if that makes any difference. I know it's cheesy and trite writing, but it was actually really scary, and I was crying on the way back home. I don't know how to describe how the dog walked, but it was not normal. Anyways, I might just be paranoid, but everything about the situation was honestly just so scary and weird that I felt like I needed to share it with someone and see what their thoughts were. I've been terrified and home, unable to sleep because even if it wasn't a skinwalker, it was a murderer who probably hadn't showered since the murder, and also he had a creepy ass dog. One night, my mate and I were camping by a secluded lake on my private property, deep in the Australian bush. Surrounded by towering gum trees, I lived about 35 to 40 minutes from the nearest town. It was a chilly evening in July, and the branches of the gum trees overhead were swaying ominously in the breeze. My friend, who I'll call Jack, joined me for the night. As we relaxed at the campsite, enjoying a bit of weed in front of the campfire, I had an idea for a bit of fun. Since we were both really high, we decided to go for a wander through the bush. Bad part is, neither of us had brought a flashlight, so Jack and I ventured down a narrow path into the enveloping darkness of the bush. Jack was a few steps ahead of me when he suddenly froze. I started hearing strange, unsettling noises. As I turned to my left, Jack remained fixed, staring straight ahead. A faint sound, like a distant tinkling of a bell, but not exactly like that, filled the air. The noise grew louder and closer until it seemed to be right beside me. In a moment of fear, I let out a sharp gasp. Jack turned around, his expression filled with concern. "We should go back," he urged, his eyes wide with alarm. Back at the campsite, Jack finally revealed, "You want to know why I wanted to turn back?" Intrigued, I asked, "Why?" "I saw something. A huge, shadowy figure just behind one of the trees," he replied, his voice lowering to a whisper. Apparently, while I was preoccupied with eerie sounds, Jack had been transfixed by a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to lurk in the darkness for what felt like an eternity, until my gasp broke the spell.
When I was a young fella, my brother and I would often take camping trips out to the river. It was usually just myself and my bro, but I remember this one trip, my stepbrother and his girlfriend came along. I vaguely remember parts of this trip, but some stuff stands out. I'll go over the one notable occurrence. That's what you're here for, right? The creepy stuff. Well, yeah, it definitely was that. We had been out that way many times, and despite it being quite an eerie looking spot, it was never scary. I didn't think so anyway. The first time I remember being truly scared out there, it was myself, my brother and my stepbrother. We were walking and talking, and my stepbrother starts trying to scare us, telling us stories of things that supposedly lurked out there in the bush. I remember distinctly, this was the first time I ever heard about the Quinkins. He kept telling us random stories about people who had seen them. This would be my very first introduction to Aboriginal spirits and beasts. It wasn't at that point I got truly scared though. I was more fascinated than anything. I had always been into dark and scary things, so these stories, they simply captivated my imagination rather than freaked me out. It was when we rounded a bend and came into a large clearing, one that housed a very sizable waterhole, that the scary stuff began. I remember my stepbrother. He just stopped on the spot and in an instant turned and bolted off down the road. That gave me and my brother a fright. It wasn't entirely out of the ordinary though. This bloke was a weirdo, and he'd often do random shit like this. But then we saw what caused him to run. Picture this scene, right? This waterhole, it's pretty bloody big, and on the far side of it, there's this massive rock wall. During the daylight hours, it's a popular activity for people to climb up the side and jump off into the water. At night though, it's always deserted. Not tonight though. We see it, and at first, it's just barely discernible shadows. Then we start to make out forms. My brother's the first to say it. Is that people up there? And we both just stare up. I saw it too. Yep, for sure. Human-shaped figures walking up the rocks off to the side. There's about 5 or 6 of them dragging their bodies up the scrub. Not walking, I mean quite literally dragging themselves up. Their arms and legs flailing outwards as they do so. As they get to the top, they all kinda line up side by side, still laying on their guts. Now, their heads and the tops of their torsos hanging over the edge of the rock wall. That's bloody dangerous. Yeah, people jump from there, but there's a certain spot you gotta jump from to clear any rocks beneath. These guys, they're aiming their heads right towards those rocks, and they're teetering right on the edge. At this point, we yelled out, "Hey, what are yous doing? Get down from there, you dickheads. You're gonna get hurt." But they didn't listen. Instead, in unison, they simply leaned further and further over the rock wall edge before plummeting downwards. We watched in horror as these people bounced off the rocks on the way down before splattering into the waters at the bottom, much of which made for shallow cover over sharp rocks just beneath the surface. There's no way in hell anyone's surviving that. We stood there in a state of shock at what we had just witnessed. We had just watched people die right in front of us. That horror lasted barely a second before it was replaced by another. For when we glanced back up to see if we could catch a glimpse of where they ended up, we surely did, but not as we expected. Cold fear gripped us in an instant as we watched these things bobbing up and down in the water, floating ever so slowly towards us, their heads straight up and ahead, their faces pointed at us. It was very clear now that we were not looking at human beings. These things were shadowy, dark, humanoid, but far from human. Their faces were the dead giveaway. You could barely make out these once human features, but the eyes were hollow, as were the mouths that gaped wide open as they floated through the water, coming ever closer to us. It is a strange sensation, being literally frozen in fear. Unless you've experienced it, you can't possibly understand it. But in that moment, all we could do was stand there in the night, nothing but the splish-splash of the water as these things bobbed up and down, ominously surfing their way towards us. It was only when they reached the banks of the waterhole and began dragging their disgusting forms up out of the water, and we got a close-up look at their gaping mouths and lanky, shadowy limbs, that we turned and ran, just as my stepbrother had before. It was obvious that these things were chasing us. As we clambered up the sands, making a beeline for the cover of the bush, we would steal glances back to see them practically floating after us. The strange thing was, once we hit the bush, they just kind of stopped. They were floating, dancing around on the sands. Not that we hung around to make sure that's all they were doing. We absolutely booked it back to camp, packed up our shit and told our stepbrother that we were leaving. That was my first and last time to see what I believe was a Quinkin. I mean, I have no idea what else it could have been. The description seems spot on. I suppose it could have been something else, another spirit of the land that I'm unaware of. But from the stories I've heard, that's what it was. Let me tell you, they scared me more than any other ghost I've ever heard tales of. The sheer oddity of what they were doing, yet how deliberate they were in their actions. The way they just slowly floated across that water, the way they toppled off the rock wall. None of it made any sense, and yet we were very clearly their target. I still don't know why they were coming for us that night, what their intentions were. I hate the thought of those wide, gaping mouths every time they appear in my nightmares. Yep, I still have those. People often talk of ghostly encounters with some sense of wonder, of fascination. But let me tell you, it's not. It's traumatic. It's terrifying. And I hope I never see these things again.
I'm an Australian scout, and about 2 years ago, I was a cub when this happened. The order goes Joeys, Cubs, Scouts, and Ventures if that helps. I went to this big cub camp, roughly 1,000 plus scouts. It's called Kubari. I'm not sure if I spelt it right. It's when cubs from all around Australia come together and do activities and do scout things. I don't know. Anyways, my group was called Cassowaries, with a bunch of boys and 7-ish girls. Me, my sister, and the other girls shared a tent. We stayed there for a week, but on the 5th night I woke up at around 3 to 5 a.m. by my sister. She looked terrified. She told me to look at the end of my sleeping bag, and when I looked there was blood. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and saw that there was a hole at the end of it. I looked at my foot, and there was a stab wound just under my toes. Me and my sister sat there staring at my foot until I noticed a light through the side of my tent. It looked as if a knife had cut through the tent and stabbed me. Me and my sister walked out of the tent with a flashlight. Our tent was right next to the fence. As we walked around the tent, I saw a pure white figure staring at me from behind the fence. My sister told me not too long ago that she saw the same thing. We woke the other girls and started to walk to the toilets. They were about 15 minutes from our tent. We told the other girls what we saw. My sister didn't say that she also saw the figure. One of the girls believed us. The others didn't. I showed them my foot and the hole in the tent, and they still didn't believe me. Ever since then, I've been having the same figure following me. Not in the open or in big crowds. They show up in my dreams. I've seen them quite a lot. I don't know how to communicate with them or if I want to. They act sorta as if they're my guardian, or they're trying to protect me. And it feels like they only show themselves when I'm doing something stupid or if I'm having bad anxiety. If you have any advice about what I should do, that'd be awesome. Thank you. G'day all. 40-something-year-old bloke with a story that I think would fit nicely here. Me and my mates go fishing and camping often, around the rivers in rural New South Wales. It was summertime, 2003 when this happened. We were all packed up and headed out for an alcohol-fueled weekend around Guinea, along the Manning River. It was a nice spot for fishing and some beautiful camping spots around those parts. So we're sitting around the fire that night, and as usual, we're all trying to spook each other, as you do out there late at night. Hey, boys just don't grow up, okay? We're chucking around ghost stories and tales of creepy crawlies, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, me mates stop talking and just stare right over my shoulder. I think they're messing with me, so I just say whatever, but they just keep looking straight ahead, right into the bush. Well, starting to get a bit spooked now, I turn around in my chair, real quiet. At first I didn't see anything, nothing but shade of absolute black out there in the scrub. Then, one of the shades of black took 2 giant steps toward the camp. Holy shitballs, we were not sticking around for that. All of us piled into the car and locked the doors, just in time to see this thing take another step. We could see it clear by the light of the campfire now. It was at least 8 foot tall. My first thought was the stories of yowies I'd heard growing up, but this didn't look like what I'd hear about them. It stood with bent knees, walking around sniffing the air. The arms were hairy, and the head looked like some kind of warped animal. That's what got me thinking, Skinwalker. I know there's a Navajo origin, but It's the closest thing I could draw a comparison to. This giant bloody dog, bear, human thing turned and faced our car. And it just stood there, watching us, pacing back and forth. I don't know if it could see us. The car was parked back where it was a lot darker. So maybe not. But just in case, we squished ourselves down as far as we could go, until we couldn't really see it anymore. And hopefully, it hadn't seen us. All night we stayed huddled like that, listening to this thing pace around, sometimes circling the car. We were too scared to open our eyes. Maybe it was looking in, right at us. I'll never know. All I know is that finally, it left after what felt like hours, and I was glad to never see it again. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. Yowie? Australian Skinwalker? Something else entirely? I'll never know. And you know what? I never want to.
Have you ever visited Australia? I'm guessing most of you who have said yes have probably seen the sights of Sydney, Melbourne, maybe Brizzy and the Gold Coast. If you've never been to the north, you've missed out. Picture sprawling, white sand beaches, lush rainforests and rolling green hinterlands. At the heartland of all this, North Queensland's tropical urban playground, Cairns. That's where I based myself during my last trip to Oz. There's more than enough to do in and around Cairns that you can easily kill 2 or 3 weeks. And that I did. I snorkeled, I dived, I fished, I hiked, and I swam to my heart's content. The whole trip was set to culminate with a 3-night hike and camp excursion into one of the region's most extensive rainforests, the Daintree. A group of 5 of us, including the tour guide, would take part. They like to keep the groups for these tours small so as to minimize their impact on the natural environment. We set off on a Sunday morning, fog enveloping the road as we headed off toward our point of entry. My senses went into overload as soon as I stepped out of the van and took in the smells and the sights of the rainforest. It was nothing short of breathtaking. Hours and hours we trekked, our guide ensuring we followed a path of relative safety along the way. I say relative because, well, that's what it was. We all signed waivers before embarking on this tour, and we were all aware of the risks. There are a great many things within the Aussie rainforests quite capable of killing you. Not least of all, the mighty cassowary birds. And if you get close enough to the Daintree River, you might just find yourself an easy meal for a crocodile. I was confident, however, that our guide would get us through safely. I wasn't going to waste my time worrying about things that could go wrong when I was surrounded by some of the most beautiful natural scenery on the entire face of this planet Earth. Day 1 came to an end and it was time to set up camp. We did so in a small natural clearing. This was part of the appeal of this tour. Nothing we were going to see, sleep on, nor walk on was man-made. Well, aside from our swags, of course. We settled in for the night, and I fell into a blissful sleep, drifting off to the ambient sounds of the night. We all awoke the next morning to birdsong, a light patter of rain, and the morning sun shining tiny little rays of light down beneath the thick canopy. Even at full pelt, it struggled to break through. So, a lot of the time we were left relying on our flashlights. It must have been a couple of hours into the next day's hike when we noticed a member of our group was missing. Instantly, our guide went into protocol mode, backtracking the path that we had come from. He was, of course, reassuring everyone, keeping us calm, but I could see it in his eyes. The fear was setting in. This wasn't right. A member of our group had disappeared within a matter of seconds, without anyone noticing. We were rightfully scared, but it was when we spun around to find a second member of our group gone that the panic really set in. Myself and the remaining member of our group resolved to keep each other in eyeshot at all times. The tour guide wasn't taking any more chances, grabbing me by the arm and exclaiming, "We're leaving, now." Didn't need to tell me twice. We began the long trek back out of the rainforest. Strangely, our guide continuously urged us to walk with haste, but not to run. I found this odd, of course, as if there was something out here picking people off. Wouldn't we want to get the hell out of here as fast as possible? Occasionally, our pace would quicken into a jog, and our guide would hiss at us, "Slow down, don't move too quickly." And so we obeyed, walking as quickly as we could, while making the least amount of noise possible. As we walked, I began to notice things, shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. Imperceptible at first, but more and more noticeable the longer we walked. They began as flashes, something I could pass off as nothing. And at first, I was resolved to not look anywhere but straight ahead. It was not until one of these shadows caught my eye, and then failed to leave the edges of my vision, that I took a peek. Not normal. What I was looking at was entirely wrong. It was something resembling the human form, but hunched, thicker than it should be. A look of complete and total emptiness on its face, as its beady, black eyes stared back at me. A feeling of something ancient, something primitive, something altogether wrong. The others had noticed it too, it seems, as all three of us were now locked in the trance I had found myself in. Our breaths short, quickening. And as we gazed, it began to step forward. One step, then another, then another. The crunch of a dry leaf beneath its awful form was enough to snap us out of our stupor, as our guide breathed a quick series of words, which we followed without question. "On my mark, follow me, do not look back, run." And so we did. We ran. We ran faster than I ever thought possible. All the while, I could hear something behind us. Something inhuman. Something moving much faster than it looked like it should have been able to. I began to feel my breathing intensify, my lungs burning, my legs inevitably turning to jelly. Adrenaline was pushing our bodies far past the point of physical exhaustion, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before instinct could fuel us no further. For one of us, this would sadly not be an issue, as I saw a black flash roar past me and drag my one remaining tour companion into the forest. I heard the most god-awful scream I have ever heard, and as I continued to run, to my horror, I heard the unmistakable sound of a man being eaten alive. Those sounds will haunt me until the day I take my final step into death's embrace myself. We did not stop. We continued running until the canopy began to open up, until the sun began to beat down upon us, until finally we emerged from that damned rainforest, from that nightmare. The two of us practically threw ourselves into the van, and we floored it off down the tiny access road. I lay in the back, exhausted, traumatized, and absolutely devastated. I had just witnessed something not of this earth, something vile, something evil. I would never forget the look of that thing as it took those slow steps toward us. That look on its face, that look of utter indifference towards us. It had no sympathy for us. All it knew is that it was hungry. I've never experienced a feeling like that before. A feeling of a complete and total lack of empathy being felt towards you. It is the most helpless I have ever felt in my life, and I hope I never experience that again. That drive out of the rainforest, down that lonely access road, was absolutely harrowing. For as I gazed out of the side of the window of the van, I saw something that made me realize just how lucky I was to still be among the land of the living. I saw the unmistakable sight of dozens, no, maybe hundreds of pairs of beady eyes staring out from within the trees.
Let's get one thing straight. I've hiked the Blue Mountains before, but nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced during what was supposed to be a routine trek through its canyons. It began as a clear morning, the kind Aussies brag about. The eucalypt haze that gave the Blue Mountains their name wrapped around the cliffs in a dreamy shroud. I set off from Katoomba, pumped for a day of solitude and the haunting beauty of the Gross Valley. Honestly, I should have turned back when I first felt that tingle on my neck, the one you get when you think someone's watching you. But being the dauntless bloke I pretend to be, I chalked it up to the chill of the mountain air. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, mind set on the shifting shadows between the gum trees, and that's when I got lost. The paths here wind around and double back like a snake. I've trekked them plenty, but today they had teeth, and they bit me, hard. Hours passed, and I realized I was properly stuffed. Night fell like a curtain, fast, unforgiving. I've never known dark like that, not the city kind. This was a velvety, pressing darkness that oozes into your bones and stays there. My phone's flashlight cut through it like a weak whisper against a thunderstorm. Every tree looked like a gnarled hand, and every bush rustle felt like a warning. Here's the goosebump bit. I wasn't alone. Not once did I see it clearly, but by the twitch of twilight, there was something behind me, a presence that hummed with malice. You know those stories of Aussie spirits? The ones old-timers talk about in hushed tones by the fire? I'd laugh them off, but out here, laughter was about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. It felt like a hunt, and I was the quarry, stumbling over roots, my breath a ragged prayer. My phone beeped a low battery warning. Seriously, now? I pushed through the bush, gripping the phone like a talisman, but even tech's cold comfort was slipping away. The hours to dawn stretched eternal. My world shrunk to the feeble circle of my dying light. When the brush gave way to an open dirt road, it felt like a mirage. I was giddy with relief, like this was some twisted, outback Wizard of Oz junk. There wasn't a yellow brick road, but I'd have kissed the dirt if I hadn't been so parched. I followed it, boots crunching. When the ranger station silhouetted against a night, I could have wept. The ranger was a bloke named Daryl. Look of a man who's seen it all, and then some. He listened to my tale with a grave nod and gave me a lift back to my ute, throwing glances to the rear view, like he expected my ghostly mate to be thumbing a ride. "Don't hike alone," he said, his voice almost lost in the engine's growl. "Especially not when the mountain's restless." I haven't been back since. People say it was all in my head. Dehydration, panic, the bush playing tricks. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, when the city's asleep and my flat's quiet, I swear I hear that whisper of a presence. Feel that shiver down my spine. Sydney's got enough to explore without looking for trouble. You ever find yourself up in the Blue Mountains? Stick to the beaten path. And for the love of all that's holy, respect the signs, both the ones in the ground and the ones in the gut. And bring a bloody good torch. Just 2 years ago, my friends and I went for a short Bangkok trip. While we were there, we stayed in a hotel in the Pratunam area. It was near First Hotel. Upon checking in, the four of us split into the 2 rooms. I was unpacking my stuff when I heard knocking noises. It sounded like it came from the end of the corridor. My friend's unit was situated there. My roommate and I opened the door to check out what was going on. Nothing. I was surprised no one else bothered to look out at the corridor to see what was happening. As time went by, the knock got exceptionally loud, and it was definitely from the area near my friend's room. After much discussion, my roommate and I braved our way to our friend's room. She told us that she heard the knocks, but ignored them. She was actually telling us to stop knocking on her door like that, as she was trying to rest. We tried explaining it wasn't us, and she was just skeptical because she knew me as someone playful. I was let off the hook finally when the next round of knocking occurred. It was so loud that I could hear it clearly from my room. My room phone rang, and my friend asked us if we were the ones responsible for the loud knocking. I replied, "Are you kidding me? We are both in the room watching TV. How can we be knocking on your door and be in the room at the same time?" We got the hotel staff to come to her room. They started explaining that the knocks were coming from the wall. Another one said it was coming from the aircon. Bullshit. To settle the matter, my 2 friends were given another room just opposite mine. After they left their old room, we never heard any knocking sounds anymore. I was a former student of St. Hilda's Secondary School. I was in Secondary 3 back then, when the school organised a history field trip to Bangkok. Part of the tour was staying a night on a floating, electricity-less chalet, as they called it, on River Kwai. River Kwai is a river which separates Burma and Thailand, and there we were on that river. The place was really beautiful, so serene and peaceful, without the hustle and bustle of the city. But at around 6 in the evening, the place was already dark, partially because we were in between forest, and to top it up, there weren't many lights, and we had to use oil lamps. Anyway, on this particular night, right after dinner, the whole group of us sat outside our rooms in the open to talk. Then one of my friends suggested we tell ghost stories. Maybe it was pure coincidence, but the moment he said that, there was a really strong, heavy, sweet scent of frangipani. Everyone literally froze until the scent diffused away. Soon after some time, I felt I really needed to stretch my back. As I stretched to face the river, I wasn't sure if I was just imagining or if it was real, but I actually saw 3 white figurines floating cross-legged on the waters and looking right at us. I couldn't speak for a moment, till one of my friends had to shake me for me to realize what had happened. I think by that time everyone else was already feeling uneasy, so we decided to go back to our rooms to sleep. And just as I was about to get up from the floor, I felt something pulling me down. I couldn't get up. I tried to pull myself, but to no avail. I remembered trying to call for my friends, but I just couldn't. Anyway, somehow or another, I managed to pull myself up when the elastic band around my shorts snapped. I thought to myself, probably my shorts got entangled with some nail in the floor. I rubbed my palms on the floor to feel if there's any nail, but there was nothing. I was running a high fever the very next day, which lasted about a week. Until now, I still wonder what pulled my shorts, and if the figures I saw in the river were purely my imagination. I just want to share one of my horrid stories that I've experienced with my friend when we spent our holiday in Bangkok last year. My friends and I stayed in this resort in Bangkok, which was located near the seaside. Can't tell you guys the name, but it surely spooked the skeleton out of me. The resort was enormously big, with hundreds of rooms, but the problem is, not many people stayed there, and the building was darn scary. It was literally dark, and at night we could hear the waves and the trees rustling eerily, like it has this kind of evil aura. Our first night in the hotel turned into hell. We booked 2 rooms that basically were beside each other. Okay, everything turned out right when we first checked into our rooms, but things started to go wrong when I went to bathe. When I was in the shower, I could feel something lurking behind me, like viciously. I felt so uneasy that I ran out of the shower with my bathrobe on and told my friend about it. Then, after the first encounter around 11 p.m, all of us stayed in the same room and watched TV. All of a sudden, the phone rang. One of my friends picked it up, and I'm telling you, she was as white as a sheet. She dropped the phone and put it on the loudspeaker so all of us could hear it. It sounded like a lady wailing and crying at the same time. We were freaked out and tried to call the receptionist for help, but no one picked up, which is weird. So we planned to go down to the lobby, which is quite far, and we needed to walk. Just for your information, the rooms that we booked are kind of like bungalows. After we put on our jackets and grabbed our umbrellas, it was raining. We went out. We held our hands together, all of us are girls, and tried to calm each other. But when we strolled by the pond, we saw something we shouldn't see. There was a dark figure of a lady wearing a shredded, dirty brown gown looking at us. When I saw through her dark eyes, I knew from that second she didn't belong here. Her eyes were as dark as night. Without thinking too much, we ran as fast as we could. But one of my friends fainted, so I had to carry her on my back under the heavy rain. I know it sounds like bullshit, but when we ran through the bungalows and the trees, We saw her, hovering off her feet and trying to keep pace with us. I was about to faint too when I saw her do that thing. My knees were trembling because of fear, not from carrying my friend. One of my friends is a Buddhist, so when we ran at the same time, I could hear that she was chanting mantras. A few minutes passed. We arrived at the counter with our clothes soaked wet. We told the whole story to the security guard, and they let us rest in the lobby until the guards finished checking our room. This experience caused me trauma for the rest of my life. For the first time, I saw pure evil. I'll never forget how dark her eyes were. It was early 2013. I was in Bangkok with a large group of friends. We split into 3 rooms on the same floor. If I recall correctly, it's the 6th floor or the 8th. The rooms were opposite ends of each other. 3 girls in each of the 2 rooms, and 2 guys in the last room. On our first day, in the afternoon sometime after checking in, I called one of our friends in the other room to check on what time we will all be heading out. When she finally picked up, she motioned for us to go over to her room ASAP in an urgent tone. When we arrived in the room, the friend that picked up mentioned that when the phone rang, she heard someone talking to her from the living room while the other 2 girls were sleeping beside her in the bedroom. On the first night, I was alone with friend 1 after our shower, and we're just resting, minding our own business in the room. Friend 2 was out shopping at the night market downstairs. After quite some time, we heard the voice of friend 2 chatting outside our room to someone. It seemed like a conversation, but we can only make out one voice. After a few minutes, suddenly it gets really eerie, and friend 2's voice was laughing. Both friend 1 and I had major goosebumps, and we turned to look at each other. We called out to friend 2 to check if it's really her. No response. Silence. And then, friend 2 laughed again. We were majorly creeped out already, and called the next room with the 2 guys to come and fetch us. When they came and got us, they confirmed that no one was in the corridor outside our room, and they didn't see our friend 2 either. So we all just camped at the guys' room till friend 2 returned from her shopping fest, only 2 hours later. That same night too, while my friends and I had our creepy incident, at apparently the same time, the girls in the other room were just chatting in the bedroom, when suddenly the shower tap in the bathroom turned on by itself, and then switched off by itself. The next night while showering, I swear I felt someone was watching me in the toilet. And worse, I heard friend 1 talking to me from outside the bathroom door. And when I exited the bathroom, there was no one, and both friend 1 and friend 2 were in the other girl's room, hanging out. That was about it. Nothing visually seen, but a lot of hearing things, and creepy incidents and goosebump fests. Won't ever return here again, despite its awesome centralized location. Plus, the rooms don't seem well maintained and no Wi-Fi either. In 2005, I made a trip to Bangkok alone. Prior to traveling, I did some research on the internet to book a cheap hostel room in Bangkok. I decided to stay at this modern hostel in a private housing estate. The hostel was 4 stories high. I was allocated a 4-female bedroom on the top floor. When I arrived at the hostel, it was already past midnight. I opened the bedroom door quietly so as not to disturb the 2 backpackers who were sound asleep. I chose to sleep at the upper bunk of double-decker beds, mainly because the 2 lower bunks were occupied. When I woke up the next day, I was alone. The 2 female backpackers had left the hostel. On the second night, I returned to the hostel late at night. When I unlocked the bedroom door, I realized I had the room to myself that night. That did not pose a problem to me, as I was used to sleeping alone. After cleaning up, I moved my personal belongings from the upper bunk to the lower bunk of the same bed. I was already in bed and the room was cooled by the air conditioning unit. Before I drifted to sleep, I had an unusual experience. A thought suddenly crossed my mind, asking me, what if the bed shook? Immediately, the double-decker bed shook violently for a few seconds. I just pretended to ignore the shaking and stayed put under the blanket, as if nothing happened. I thought that if I ignored the mischief, it would give up and go away. Seconds later, I felt a mysterious cool breeze that blew directly under my blanket from an unknown source behind my left shoulder. That could not be the breeze from the air conditioning unit, as the unit was located above the double-decker bed. The next day, I woke up feeling alright. I could not explain what happened last night though, so I got ready to explore Bangkok that day. I returned late at night again. By the third day, I was feeling apprehensive about sleeping in that bedroom alone. I wanted to check out and looked for another hostel, but I had already paid for a 4-night stay in full when I checked in on the first night. At that time, I did not know I had the right to request a change of room, which I did not exercise. So I braved myself to sleep inside that creepy room for 2 more nights. That night, after cleaning up, I stayed up outside the room, sitting on a couch and watching television. I thought I could delay the time to be spent in that room by staying up very late. Unfortunately, a tired body and mind need to rest. I had no choice but to go to bed. As I stood beside the double-decker bed before I slipped in, I saw a tall, skinny, translucent white apparition standing in front of me beside the head of the bed. I could not see its face, but only its lanky body, without arms or hands. It looked as if it wore a white robe. Seconds later, it disappeared into thin air. Mysteriously, I was not disturbed that night, or on the last night. I haven't returned to that hostel since then, and still could not believe that a bed could shake on its own without any logical explanation. Been really into ghost stories recently, so I thought I might as well input mine here. These events didn't happen to me, but to my ex-Thai girlfriend. She told me these stories many years ago when we were still together. For you folks out there, if you don't know yet, Thais really believe in the existence of the spirit world. The stories I'm about to tell you are about the encounters my ex-girlfriend had in her life. There are a total of 4 encounters, which she told me personally, and the last one, which I shared partial encounters with her through the space of the internet world. First story, abandoned factory. When she was in her late teens and in her pre-U, she and a group of friends, a mix of 3 guys and 3 girls, were out partying at night. After the party, one of the guys decided to drive to an abandoned factory just on the outskirts of Bangkok. The place used to be a toy factory, but a fire broke out there many years ago. Many people perished in the accident, and it has been rumored to be haunted since. I'll be quoting her by translating what she told me in Thai from now. After a few drinks, my male friend dared everyone to visit the toy factory, just a 45-minute drive outside of Bangkok. Me and my 2 other female friends didn't want to go as it was late and the idea was crazy, and we're scared of ghosts. But since he was the only one driving at that time, we could only comply. The drive took us through a semi-forested area that led to a big metal gate that was padlocked. Within the metal gate stood the 7-storied abandoned factory. Some of the windows were shattered and weeds and overgrown shrubs were everywhere. The first thing I noticed when I exited the car was the chillness of the air. Me and the other girls were really frightened and pleaded with the guys not to go in there. But I think because of the alcohol they consumed earlier, it made them kind of stupid. The car was parked just a few feet away from the gate, because in front of the gate were heaps of rubbish, broken furniture and stuff. While we made our way to the gate, a fog on the ground started to appear out of nowhere, and wind started to rise. And it was at this time that me and the other girls decided enough is enough, and we immediately squatted down and hid our head within the folds of our arms. I remember, while with my head tugged down, I could see the ground where I had squatted. The fog was getting thicker and thicker, and I could hear the wind making whistling noises. I was very scared, and started to pray and told my 2 other female friends to do the same. The guys laughed and continued their way to the gate and climbed over it. After a while, I could hear that their voices were getting softer as they made their way into the factory. I could still hear them talking as if discussing which way to enter the building. This time, I looked up to see where they were, and I could see one of them shining a torch at the facade of the building. Suddenly one of them shouted, and the next thing I saw, 3 of them were running back to the gate, with one person laughing while running. They reached the gate and climbed over and came to us. Me and the other girls stood up and told them we wanted to leave immediately. We asked the guy who shouted what happened. He said that when he was shining his torch at one of the windows, he saw a shadow with red eyes looking back at him. Suddenly, after he said that, all of us heard the familiar digital charm of a factory announcement, Dan, 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 followed by the howling of dogs. We ran to the car as fast as we could and drove off immediately. Second story, unwelcome visitor. This story happened not long after the factory story. My ex-girlfriend was staying by herself in an apartment around Bangkok, Lad Phrao area. I know which condo, but I will not mention names here. Same thing, I'll be quoting her by translating what she told me in Thai for now. I was having an afternoon nap when suddenly I became wide awake and jumped straight up from my bed. I don't know what it was, but I felt something was in my room with me when I was meant to be all alone. I turned to my right where my desk was, and right then, the armchair, which was one of those typical black study armchairs with rotating axis and wheels on the bottom, turned very quickly and swiftly and stopped at an angle where the front seat faced directly at me. It was as if someone was sitting in the armchair and swinging their weight to the right and stopped it with their feet. I was so scared, but I pretended to remain calm. My phone was beside me then, so I picked it up slowly with shaking hands and called my ex-boyfriend. I asked him if he could come over now because something happened to me. After I put down the phone, the chair was still at the same position, as if the thing sitting on it was watching me. I didn't move until my ex-boyfriend opened the door, and I ran and pulled him outside and told him what had happened. He helped me move the chair to the dumpster downstairs afterwards. Third story, unwelcome visitor 2. This story happened not long after the second story. It happened in the same apartment. I was sleeping at night when I suddenly woke up. My eyes remained closed, as I felt the same feeling that someone was in the room with me, despite me being alone. The only sound I could hear was a soft humming of the air conditioner and the occasional soft street noise down below in the alley. Then suddenly, I can hear the sound of a loose wheelchair going around my bed, despite the fact that my bed has the head against the wall. It sounded like someone sitting in a wheelchair and pushing and going around my bed. I closed my eyes and prayed as hard as I could. The sound got faster and faster, and then suddenly, it was gone. I immediately jumped straight out of bed and dashed out of my room. Fourth story, unwelcome visitor 3. This story happened when I was still with her. Being in a long-distance relationship with her, our only way to see each other every day was through Skype. And during weekends when both of us weren't working, we would make it a point to stay at home to see each other. Yes, we did that for almost 4 years, most weekends and every night. One particular Sunday afternoon, while I was on my PS3 and she was taking a nap in her bedroom, her laptop was in the living room. This was a new condo, one of those 32 square meter small studio apartments with a small kitchen and small living room. Suddenly I heard her shouting and screaming while she ran from her bedroom to the living room laptop. I can see through the Skype cam that she was pretty freaked out and shaking and was crying and talking very fast. She said, while taking her nap, she suddenly woke up, but she could not move her body. She could only move her eyes. She glanced down and saw a figure sitting, with her back slightly facing at the corner of her bed. It was a female wearing white with long, messy hair. She could not speak, and when she tried to shout for me, no voice came out. The figure started to turn her head and body slightly. The way it moves is in stop motion, like in dropped frame motion. Her hair was covering her face. Just as she was about to raise her head and reveal her face, my ex-girlfriend closed her eyes and prayed silently inside. And that's when I heard all the screaming and shouting. Okay, that's all. It may not be very scary, but it sure spooked me out listening to her stories and seeing her like that through the Skype cam. One time when my daughter and I first moved into my house, it was a weekend and she asked me to go to her friend's house and play. Because it was 8 a.m. on a Saturday, I told her sure, got her coat together, gave her some money, said goodbye and she left. I went back to sleep for a couple of hours and then woke up and started cleaning like I always do on weekends. I was in the bathroom, cleaning the toilet with my music on, and suddenly I hear the front door open and close. I just assumed it was my daughter, and was assured it was when I see the blur of her pink winter coat walk by the bathroom door. It was a fluffy ski coat, so I heard it too. In passing, I say, "Hey, what are you doing home?" She didn't answer me, so I just assumed she didn't hear me. She was in the room for maybe 30 seconds, and I saw her walk back by the bathroom. I asked her if she was leaving again. She didn't answer. I said louder, "Be home before supper. I love you." And she said I love you too, and closed the door. I realized that I had trash I could have her take out to the trash can while she was home. So I went to the front door to catch her and realized that her house key lanyard was on the table beside the door, and the deadbolt was locked. My house key on my car keychain was on the table too, but the deadbolt that has to be locked with a key from the outside was locked. I opened the door to look outside, and no one was there. I kind of thought that maybe she just stayed home, so I looked around the house for her. She wasn't anywhere to be found. I checked the back door, and the deadbolt was locked there too. When I called her, she told me she was playing with her friend and that they had been building a snowman all day. I asked her if she'd been home, and she said no. I asked her again if she was playing a joke on me, and she said no. She didn't take her house key, but didn't think of it as a big deal because I would be home when she got home and could let her inside. I still couldn't figure out how she locked the deadbolt, so I asked her that. She told me that she had locked the bottom block only. At this point, she was starting to get scared, so I played it off as a misunderstanding and told her I loved her and I would see her when she got home. I still don't know who that was who walked by the bathroom door, and I have no clue who or what locked that deadlock without the key. The only two keys that exist to unlock our doors were sitting on the table right by our door. To this day, I still believe it was my daughter's doppelganger. We had many experiences in that house with ghosts after that day. It got bad enough at one point that I purchased a bigger bed because my daughter wouldn't sleep in her room without me. We eventually moved, and I blame it partially on that damn house. I was never really scared, but my daughter was, and it was really a helpless feeling. This happened last year, around September. I was sick at the time. I was off from school, stuck at home with the flu, and feeling like absolute garbage. Everyone else was out. Mum was at work, Dad was on a business trip, my sister was at school, and I was trying to get some rest in my room. I left the door open because, moving around felt like running a marathon, so I took a nap, because what else can you do when you're in that state? When I woke up, the house was super quiet, and then I thought I could hear a kind of shuffling from down the far end of the hall. The sound of footsteps started getting closer and closer. I didn't think much of it until I saw my mum walk right past my door. As she walked past, she was looking right at me, unblinking, directly into my eyes, but she didn't stop to check on me or anything. Then it happened again, like 5 minutes later. The same thing. She walked by, held eye contact, and kept going. I figured she was home from work, but it freaked me out because I thought, why isn't Mum saying anything? I grabbed my phone to text her, and that's when I saw the time. It was only 11:15 a.m. And there it was, a text from my mum asking if I needed anything from the store because she was going to the supermarket after work. I was seriously creeped out. The rest of the day nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake off what I saw. I also couldn't rest much after that and closed my door immediately. Later on that evening I told my mum and my sister what had happened. I thought they'd say I was just seeing things because of the fever, but they both got really quiet. They both told me that they had seen something like that before too. My sister seeing my mum, and my mum seeing my dad. We couldn't figure it out, and even though nothing like that happened again, we still talk about it sometimes, trying to make sense of it. We moved out of that house a couple of months after this, and nothing else ever happened. I was taking a nap during the day, and I woke up to my husband standing beside my bed. Why I woke up at that particular moment, I don't know. Strangely enough, he was drinking a 20-ounce bottle of soda and shaking his hips back and forth as if to say, "Haha, I have a soda and you don't." Like a child would, I suppose. Immediately, I became aggravated and sat up and yelled, "Lewis, go away and leave me alone." As I watched, fully awake and right before my eyes, my husband started to disappear from the feet up in a fashion that looked digital. I began to be able to see that he was made up of little squares, and they were quickly disappearing from his feet up until he was completely gone. I've never been so freaked out in all of my life. The other thing about this vision was that it was completely, deathly silent. There was no sound at all, and it was almost like there was a vacuum, or as though the thing itself made everything around it even more silent. For example, my fan that was beside my bed didn't seem to be making a sound. I immediately went upstairs and called him on his cell. He was, and had been all day, in Alabama, working. He is a railroad supervisor. The things I know for sure are, 1, that thing was not my husband. 2, I was definitely awake and not dreaming because I went directly upstairs after seeing it. And 3, I know the everyday term for these things are doppelgangers. I want to know more. What exactly is behind a doppelganger? What or who is it that makes them occur? Also, if anyone is an expert on these things, I'd be interested to know why I chose to imitate my husband, and why the dorky, childish soda dance. I've seen paranormal things in the past, but to me, evidence of a ghost makes sense. You know what they are, and pretty much where they come from. But this thing is just too bizarre to me. What creeps me out the most though, I wonder how long it stood over me while I was sleeping, before I sensed it and woke up and saw it. I have a friend who's really into this occult kind of stuff. I don't know if she practices anything or her habits around it. I just know she likes strange things. She likes to buy antiques and even has an old lamp from a dead lady's house. She was a little strange, but I've known her since she was young, so that stuff didn't bother me. We stopped talking for a number of years because we were growing up and going to different schools, etc. But she randomly messaged me one summer and asked how I was doing. She invited me to do a little get-together, and we caught up. I learned that she was sensitive to spirits and didn't think too much about it then. After spending some time with her, I invited her to my house for a sleepover. We were laying in bed. We shared the same bed, just chatting and stuff before sleeping. The lights were off, and we were just giggling, talking about random stuff. All of a sudden she hides under the blankets and is terrified. I ask her, what's wrong? She tells me that she sees a man at the end of the bed and asks me to check. I look and see nothing there. I tell her I don't see anyone. She kind of gets quiet and didn't really talk much for the rest of the night. I shook it off and thought maybe she was just tired and decided to get some sleep myself. As I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear this creepy whispering. It was indistinguishable, but lasted for minutes. And it kind of freaked me out, so I put a pillow over my ears and tried to reason it as just white noise or my ears ringing. But it was just freaking creepy. The next morning I get up to use the bathroom. She's still sleeping. I use the bathroom in the hallway and leave the door slightly ajar because I was too lazy to close the door. I see this man, looks like my grandfather who lives with me, dressed in white, walk past the door once. Then, a few seconds later, walks past the door again, towards my parents' room, and I hear the door shut. Now, my grandpa hardly ever goes into my parents' room, so that was already sketchy. And it was weird that he was kind of hovering back and forth like that. I was so sketched out, I walked straight out of the bathroom, not even turning off the lights, and trudged over to my parents' room. I see absolutely no one in there except my dad snoring away, wearing a black shirt. I check the closet. I check their bathroom. Nothing. Also, my parents' room is at the very end of the hall, so there are no stairs and no way to exit. So nobody could have gone past me, walking towards my parents' room, without me 100% running into them. I run downstairs. It's about 10 a.m. at this point, and I ask my mum where my grandpa is. Turns out he's been out all morning at an appointment. I asked her if she'd been upstairs in the past 5 minutes. She says she's been downstairs since 7 a.m. I'm obviously freaked out by this point. My friend walks down and I tell her everything that happened. You know what she says? She goes, "Oh, him." I give her a puzzled look. She explains to me that ever since her get-together, I brought him with me, and that he hasn't left her alone since. She also mentioned that the more I hang out with her, the more I'll see things. I noped the heck out of there. Haven't seen her since, although we do still text here and there sometimes. Never saw him again. I have had a few odd experiences throughout my life, but nothing that I would necessarily label as paranormal. At least, not until recently. Full disclosure, I love watching specials about the paranormal. I enjoy reading books about supposedly true hauntings, as well as movies about ghosts, demons, etc. That being the case, I'm familiar with some of the classic telltale signs of a location that is purportedly haunted. Bad smells, vertigo, cold spots, whispers, etc. But again, taking into account what I know about those things, and considering it is a hobby of sorts to read about them, nothing paranormal has ever happened to me. That all changed a couple of weeks ago, when I started dating a woman I met while at my job. I had not dated in a very long time. Divorced, single dad, pushing 40, a little thick around the waistline, etc. So it was a surprise that someone as young and pretty as she was asking me out. She's 26, but I do look much younger than my age. We hadn't gone on that many dates, maybe 3 or 4 over the course of a few weeks. So even though we communicated a lot via texts, email, Facebook, etc., we actually had not spent very much time together. So I was taken off guard that she asked me to help her out with a family matter. Her grandmother, who had been living on her own private property in a camper for 20-some odd years, just her and a lot of cats. My girlfriend, I use that term loosely because, again, we were still just getting to know each other, was one of the few members of her family that still made any effort to visit their grandmother, and described her as very eccentric, solitary, and somewhat spiteful. Recently though, her mind seemed to be going. On the rare occasions that anyone went to see her, the consensus was that she had basically gone senile, and nothing she said made any sense anymore. So they made the decision to put her in a nursing home, which is where I came in. My girlfriend, who I will call Trish, needed me to help her clean out her grandmother's camper, save anything that was worth keeping and dump the rest. So we rented a flatbed trailer, and she navigated to the property, which is in Oscar, Texas. She and I are both from Austin. We arrived about 1 p.m. in the afternoon in mid-August, so it was pretty damn hot. The camper was really small, and had only one window air conditioner unit to cool the entire thing, but there was no longer any electricity to it. So we opened the door, which was not locked, and started going through all her stuff. There was cat poop everywhere, and it smelled terrible. Plus, there were hundreds of flies. The cats were all gone. It looked like they had been coming and going through the little flaps on either side of the window unit. I started moving stuff and found several decayed dead kittens, tons of roaches, fleas, ticks, spiders. I mean, this place was a complete dive. My girlfriend was really embarrassed and said we would need some cleaning supplies, not realizing it was this bad. Since we arrived there in her vehicle, she drove into town to buy the supplies, and I decided to stay behind and keep working. While I was there alone, I figured I would haul all the big stuff out to the flatbed, which she left behind for me. The minute I started moving furniture to throw it away, the air in the camper got noticeably cooler. At least cool enough for me to notice a difference, given how hot it was outside. The fact that there was no electricity for the window unit, plus very little ventilation, made it that much more noticeable. I ignored it at first and thought nothing of it. There was a pond nearby, and I figured maybe a nice little breeze had blown over it towards me. I went about my work and began hearing limbs in the trees around the camper creaking and snapping. There was no wind though, so I figured it was probably squirrels, birds, and whatnot. I took a break and went outside for a soda, and continued to hear snapping and crackling all around me. It's probably not uncommon, but the area was unusually still for there being so much noise. I went back inside and felt the immediate drop in temperature. I suppose it could be that when we first got there, the sun was shining directly on the camper. So maybe the sun had just shifted and it was no longer in direct sunlight. Maybe. I continued digging through old boxes and found a medium-sized leather trunk with a rusted padlock on it that looked like it was ready to crumble to dust. I didn't want to throw away anything valuable, so I busted the lock off with the heel of my boot and looked inside the trunk. I found the weirdest assortment of crap I had ever laid my eyes on. Various rocks, crystals, candles, lots of little bottles with God knows what in them. Odd string, strips of leather. And then I found a small skeleton of some kind of animal. Probably a cat. But it had stuff written on the actual bones. At this point, I paused and began to feel extremely uncomfortable. It was like the air got heavier and the sounds of insects outside had stopped, and I could feel a pressure against my eardrums. The hairs on my arms and neck stood on end. It became harder to breathe and I felt something. There was almost like an electrical charge in my stomach. I know enough about this type of thing from reading about the paranormal that I could guess I was not welcome there. So I left the camper and waited outside for Trish to come back while I tried to wrap my head around what had just happened. She was gone for what seemed like a really long time, but finally came back, and she was like, "Oh, I thought you would have had it all cleaned by now." Obviously, she had stalled, hoping I would do the lion's share of the work. But I digress. Anyways, I told her about what had happened, and she was like, okay, and? It sounds like the heat got to you. Are you feeling lightheaded? Well, yeah, but for a completely different reason than heat exhaustion. I asked her if she thought what I described was strange, and she seemed amused that I had gotten scared, but didn't answer. I asked why someone would write on an animal skeleton, and she blew it off, attributing it to her grandmother's diminishing mental state. Like I said before, she was gone for a while, so we didn't have a lot of daylight left. Now that we were on a time crunch, she angrily began throwing anything and everything into the flatbed, no longer caring about looking through stuff to see if there was anything that we should keep. And really, there wasn't anything worth salvaging. It was all rotten. After a few hours, we did manage to get it cleaned out, but it became clear that cleaning this thing was not going to serve much of a purpose. It was barely standing as it was. I recommended that she get someone to just haul the whole thing away and leave whatever was still in there, which is probably what we should have done in the first place. She wanted to take one last look around the camper and make sure she didn't miss anything. Here is where things got really weird. I was securing the stuff we decided to keep on the trailer when I heard her ask, "What are you doing?" Not looking up, I said I was just making sure the stuff wasn't going to fall out. She then turned to look at me, her eyes as wide as I had ever seen them, looked back out the window she had been at, screamed and bolted out of the camper. I was like, "What? What is it?" She told me that she swore she had seen me walking on the opposite side of the camper. Not just someone that looked like me, but me. I told her to wait there and I walked around the corner of the camper. I can't really be sure, but for a brief second or two, I do think I saw the outline of a person before it disappeared. According to Trish, this man looked exactly like me, so she thought it was me. She said it even turned and smiled at her, which is when she asked what I was doing. When I answered from out by the car is when she freaked out. We both agreed that at that point there was definitely something off about the place. Not just the camper, but the actual property. I told her I don't know what her grandma was into, or what she did all alone out there for 20 years, but it didn't feel like a good thing. We left around 8 p.m, just as it started to get dark, and never went back. That isn't quite the end though. Last week, about a month after this all happened, Trish asked me if I would go with her to visit her grandma in the nursing home since, again, no one else really ever went to see her. I said sure, and we drove to a nearby city called Temple, where the nursing home was located. We got there, signed in, and they asked us to wait while I went and got her. I was in the lobby checking email on my phone, while Trish and her grandma visited together in the common area. Trish poked her head around the corner and asked me to come back with her so I could meet her grandma. On our way back to her room, Trish said her grandma looked great and seemed to be in really good health. She was lucid, not babbling, and was generally happy. But the minute she laid eyes on me, she flipped out and started screaming, "Why are you here? What do you want with me? Why did you follow me? The nurses had to restrain her, and they asked me to wait back in the lobby because me being there was upsetting her. I have no idea what to make of this. First, Trish sees someone that looks just like me. Then her grandma sees me and thinks I am following her, as if we had met before, even though I'd never seen her before in my life. I have no explanation for any of this, but it all seems too coincidental to brush off. Given what I felt on that property, the weird occult-style stuff I found there, Trish seeing someone that looked like me, plus the way her grandma reacted to seeing me, is just bizarre. Anyways, that's my story. I was not so much scared by any of it as I was fascinated. On a side note, Trish and I agreed a few days ago that dating each other just didn't have that spark we were looking for, but we remain good friends.